following is a presentation of the Fellowship Church at Anthem, a community of faith, love, and hope. For more information, please visit fellowshipanthem.com.
Man, that was nice. Good rain last night and refreshed our souls a little bit. It's so great to just feel that moisture coming in. And hope you're having a great summer. Good weekend for the Baird family. Last weekend we were out up in Flag, but great to be back with you today. It's been kind of an interesting week in our country, right? There's a lot of pain floating around our country. Tragedies in Colorado and elsewhere remind us of how fragile life can be, and it's always interesting to me to see what gets posted in social media related to what's going on in the world. And we have this ability now through social media to express something in response to the pain that we see going on in the world that 10 years ago we just didn't have. And so now there's an ability on our part when we have like a national moment of pain, like what happened this week in Colorado. Now there is an ability for those of us who are not directly affected by that. In other words, we don't know someone who either lost a life or we're injured there, but we feel a sense of pain because of that moment. We can now express it socially, publicly, and somehow I think there is some healing that happens in that. And it was interesting a couple days after that to just watch the kind of the stream of thought as people were expressing their pain over the tragedy in an event that happened that they had no direct connection to. And I really do think that expression of pain is a reflection of a growing sense of concern that we have about our world. I believe that our ability to connect with the pain of other people now is greater than it ever has been because of the news that is immediately at our disposal. And when we think about connecting to the pain on a whether it's a national level or a local level or even a global level, it should be the response of those of us who are followers of God and believe that our calling is to make the world better. We should find an outlet for that. The challenge comes for me sometimes when I open up a web browser and the news is like, it's just all one column of pain. All of these events or moments of life that have just, they're painful, and you go, how do I respond to all of that? What can I do about that? And the danger maybe for us is that we become so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the pain, we just pull back and do nothing. You ever feel like that? Like, geez, it's just overwhelming. I'm not going to do anything. I was going to give a little money here, or I was going to donate some time there, or I was going to try to call a friend there or whatever, but you know what? It's just too much. I'm not doing anything. Well, today, Jesus' story is a story that helps us connect, I believe, with some framework to how we deal with the pain that we experience and see all around us. We're in this series called Jesus Stories, and if this is your first Sunday, let me just give you a little setup here. Matthew chapter 13, Jesus talks about, or the Bible talks about Jesus' dominant teaching model. It says Jesus used stories when he spoke to the people. In fact, he did not tell them anything without using stories. Jesus understood the power of a story, and if he just told a story, it would help connect people in such a deep and powerful way that they could sort of pull their own meaning out of that story, or they could find themselves in the story and understand it at a deeper level. So today's story, if Jesus were to just give us like all the facts, he'd be like, hey, if you see somebody hurting, stop by and help them out. Amen. But he didn't do that. In fact, he used a story that totally connected with his audience to help them understand the importance of our role as healers in the world in which we live. And our role as dispensers of good to the people that are hurting around us. And the story that Jesus used to convey that message is really a powerful one. And in the context in which it was delivered, it would have been another of Jesus' revolutionary things. It would be another one of those moments where everybody hearing Jesus talk about this, some of them would have said, "Oh, we don't want to follow this guy anymore. He's too much trouble." And then others would have been, "I get it. I get what Jesus is about. I'm on board. Sign me up." It was that sort of controversy. So Jesus sets the stage. This story is found in Luke chapter 10. And what's really powerful about this story is it now is, I think in many ways, a story that transcends all of culture for us, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. This is the story of the Good Samaritan. You probably know that. Even if you're new to church or unfamiliar with the Bible, you probably are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. It's so ingrained in our culture today as a way of living that Good Samaritan, even, we have a hospital by that same name here in the valley, and many, hospitals around our country. Because the concept that Jesus is trying to communicate through this simple story, it connects with us, and it has shaped our culture. So here's the setting of what really is a very powerful story. This is in Luke chapter 10. And on one occasion, an expert in the law, now some translations read a lawyer, but that's not the same way we think about attorneys today and lawyers. This is someone who studied the law, the Torah, and knew the ins and outs of the teaching of God that was governing the people. So we begin to understand that the person sort of in charge of this moment who's asking questions of Jesus is an expert. So this is probably predominantly a Jewish audience. So they would be familiar with the law. They would be familiar with the words of Moses and other teachers of the Old Testament and God's word to the people about how they should live their lives. So that an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. I always love it when they try to test the Son of God. It just never ends well for them. So they stood up to test Jesus, and he refers to him as teacher. That would be a common title of honor, actually. Kind of wonder if it's not given tongue-in-cheek, right? It's like, hey, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And then Jesus responds in typical fashion for him, which is so interesting to me. I've been in ministry most of my adult life, and we tend to look at priests and pastors and clergy and ministers as kind of like people that give answers for God, kind of Bible answer guys and gals. And almost without exception, every time Jesus was asked a question, he did not give an answer. He responded with a question. Or in this situation, a couple of questions punctuated by a story. So here's maybe what we should do every Sunday from now on. You guys come and bring your questions, and I will respond with questions. And the occasional story of haboobs and pizzas. All right, so what's written in the law, Jesus says? How do you read it? And so then the expert of the law answers Jesus, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And those would have been, as we know in other parts of the New Testament, Jesus, when he reduced all of the important teachings of God down to two things, he said that, love God and then love people. So these would have been two very familiar passages of Scripture. Jesus tying them together is interesting because they wouldn't necessarily have tied these two together. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, Jesus is saying one of the ways we love God with all of our heart is to give love to our neighbor. And so the expert of the law fires a question back at Jesus. I'm sure he wants to appear smart. He wants to appear intelligent. He's probably, again, trying to test Jesus, trying to catch him off guard a little bit. But this is the response that he gives to Jesus. He says, Jesus says, you've answered correctly. In other words, ding, 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 ding. Good job. You win. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, the expert of the law did, so he asked Jesus. And just, for clarity, teacher, who is my neighbor? Now, for you and I, that question doesn't really hold as much meaning maybe as it did for the hearers that have been seated in the audience in which Jesus is, because it was very, very much a part of Jewish culture in that day for them to qualify who was worth their love, their attention, and their care and their compassion. In other words, as a Jew, as a practicing Jew, as a teacher of the law, I want to know who I should direct the energy of my life towards. Because if you're worth it, I want to give it to you. But if you're not, I don't have like this overabundance. I can't just be giving love to everybody. And for the practicing Jew in Jesus' day, they had taken the laws of God, which said, love God with all your heart, and then love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. And then they're like, okay, well, but hang on, that's a lot. Can we just narrow it down? And so they had basically improved on God's commands. You ever try to do that? Take God's commands and sort of self-interpret? That's what they had done. And so they said, your neighbor is really just your fellow Jew. So if you find somebody that's not a Jew, you're not obligated. Interesting, isn't it? And so Jesus, he could have lit the guy up, right? Which we would all love that. I would love that. If Jesus would he's like, so Jesus, who is my neighbor? And I'd love it, if Jesus would be like, are you kidding me? But he doesn't. He breaks into a story, and this is the story that he tells. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. So here it is. It follows in Luke chapter 10, verse 30. Jesus replied, there was a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, it's not specified particularly in this passage, but in this passage, going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, that'd be about like a 17-mile journey. There was no light rail, no bike trails, so this is a walking thing, and it's a real rugged passage down through there. It not only drops in elevation by about 3,000 feet, but it's full of like caves and crevices and little ledges and all kinds of stuff. And so it was common in this day for robbers and thieves to hide out, and they would attack unsuspecting travelers along this road. And there was a lot of travelers on the road because Jerusalem was the Mecca, right? It was the religious center. So you would go to Jerusalem to participate in worship and all those kinds of things. And so it was a great spot if you were looking to try to, rob someone and take advantage of someone. So this guy's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, so he's probably been up there for some religious celebration. He's going back to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers, and they stripped him of his clothes, and they beat him, and then they went away, leaving him half dead. And then a pastor happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. And notice this is really important language that Jesus uses when he tells the story. And you and I get it at some level, but the hearers of Jesus' day, they would really get it. Because for a pastor, for a priest, to be traveling down a road and to see someone who was half dead, they had this really strict observance for what they could and could not touch. They were not allowed to touch dead things, or they were not allowed to come in contact with blood. So no doubt the priest sees this guy who's been beat up and left for dead. Maybe he doesn't even know if he's alive or dead. He might be laying there moaning, but for sure he's bloody and beaten. And he knows that if he goes over to touch this man, he's going to become unclean. So he's going to have to go through this rite of purification that's going to last about a week. And it wasn't like this socially ostracizing kind of event. It was just a ceremonial cleansing. And it happened all the time because there was a higher law that said if you see somebody hurting, help them. Even if it means that you put yourself out, help them. Even if it means you put yourself in a position of uncleanness, help them. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So the priest walking down the road sees the man lying there half dead, bloody, bruised, beaten, naked. And look at his response, because this is really interesting. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So he made a purpose to not get too close. In fact, he probably crossed the road, went all the way around just so that he didn't have to get too close or come in contact, or maybe just so he didn't have to think about it because he didn't want to face it. So, Jesus says, a Levite, flip back one slide, Amanda. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, a Levite, they would have all known, this is not quite at the height of a priest, but he's a helper in the temple. Same response. Sees him, he's like, oh no, I don't want to get unclean. It's going to be a hassle for me. So he moves to the other side of the road and passes by and leaves the half-dead man for more dead. And so, Jesus says, and flip the slide, Amanda. Jesus said, there came a man, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. And he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, and he poured on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, which would be like 2 days' wages. And he gave them to the innkeeper, and he said, look after him. And when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. Now, what's not always clear to us about this passage is how alarming this would have been to these Jewish hearers, because Jesus says, first you have a Jewish priest that goes by and he sees this half-dead man and he passes by on the other side, and they would have been, they might have been a little bit like, well, that's understandable because he didn't want to get unclean and all that. I get that. But then the Levite comes by, another high-ranking Jewish official, not quite as high as a priest, but somebody that would have been accustomed to doing good, accustomed to living out the goodness of God. And he sees this half-dead man, and he's like, I really should help him, but, I'm busy. Or I'm going to have to get dirty. Or I don't know if I've got time to get involved in all this mess. I got deadlines. And so the audience would have been like, okay, well, yeah, that's, he really probably should have stopped and helped him, but gosh, he was maybe busy. I don't know. Maybe he had an appointment. Something was going on, and he couldn't. But then Jesus completely blows him out of the water. He says that a Samaritan came by the man. Now, for the Jewish audience, there were few groups of people that would have been more repulsive than the Samaritans. They were half-Jews. They were half-breeds. And if your whole identity is attached to the purity of your race, for someone to take on a half version of that purity would have been the ultimate in defilement. The Samaritans were Jews that intermarried, and so they polluted this pure bloodline from God. And So Jesus says the person who actually had compassion and who did the right thing was the people that you hate the most. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm amazed at the people who do the most good in the world are those who have no claim to any sort of faith or relationship to God. Have you noticed that? I mean, there's a lot of Christians that do a lot of good, and we have been about that since our beginning as a church. But it's amazing to me sometimes to watch the people who step up and do what is good for the sake of others are often those that don't seem to be motivated by the same love God, love people thing that we are. In fact, sometimes we look at the way Christians act and we go, wait a minute, does that really reflect Jesus? Because that doesn't seem very Jesus-esque. And so Jesus, he like pulls out all the offensive stops. And he's like, the person that stepped up and helped the most is the one that you hate the most. So put that in your context. I don't know where you grew up, but probably there was a group of people that you just did not like. Maybe it was racially related. Maybe if you grew up in the South, it was the blacks. Maybe if you grew up in the North, it was Yankees. Yesterday I was wearing my Boston Red Sox hat that a friend bought me, and I've only been to Boston like a couple times, and I'm not a Red Sox fan, but it's amazing how many scowls you get, like just in the grocery store. And I just walking down the store and I get a, I've come to know it now, I recognize it, and I just call it out. Yankees? Right? And I call a manager over. But anyway, so think about this in terms of who you would be most offended by if Jesus called you out for your personal bias. Maybe it's another race. Maybe it's another economic level. Maybe you grew up on the right side of the tracks and you were always kind of offended at those who grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. Because they were like the downcast, the outcast. Maybe you would read this today and you'd go, if Jesus were telling the story today and he told it to you, maybe Jesus would say something like, the priest walked by, and then the pastor walked by, and then the deacon walked by, but then the people that stopped to help were those that were gay. The gays stopped to help. And that would, inside of you, you'd be like, what? There's probably somebody inside of you that is like on the other side of goodness to you. Least likely to do the good and right thing. Jesus said that's the person that stops to help. That's the person that gives the most. That's the person that serves and loves. Now, at this point in the story, all the Jews would have had this big lump in their throat. They would have been like almost violently ill. They would have been like, we've got to leave. We've got to get out of here. This is ridiculous teaching. We cannot bear this. And so then Jesus then, he's not through yet, nor is the expert in the law. So the expert, next slide, Amanda. The expert says, Jesus says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? So Jesus comes back to the original question. Who's my neighbor? And the Jews in Jesus' day, and especially the expert in the law, he would not have been happy about being called out on this and saying, hey, here's the deal. The Samaritan in this story was the real neighbor. He did what was right. And so he answers. The expert of the law answers. I mean, he's on the spot now, right? He's in front of all these people. The one who had mercy on him. He can't even say it. He can't even say the Samaritan did it. I mean, in the public, he wouldn't even say it. It was so offensive to him. And so he just says, the one who had mercy. And so Jesus says to him, go and do the same thing. You go and be the good in the world around you. even if it costs you, even if it's painful, even if you have to get dirty, even if you have to get bloody, even if you have to get in the trenches with people, you go and do the same. Live the same kind of life. I think this story of Jesus that he tells about the right thing done in a hard moment, it is pervasive in our culture, isn't it? Because when we see people hurting today, we ask the question, what can we do? That's why Facebook blew up this week over the shootings in Colorado, because we're like, what can I do? What can I do? There's something inherently good in us that says we got to respond with what's right and what's good. What can we do? We're sitting 1,000 miles away and we don't know anybody in Colorado, but yet we feel a pain there, so we put it out there. We're like, you know what? God, help those people be better. Feel sorry for them. Pray for them. I'm so thankful for our church and for the way we have been willing to get in the trenches of people that are hurting. To reach down, not just help them up, but if we have to, climb down in the ditch with them and put our arms around them and love them and go, you know what, let's walk out of this together. Let's find a way out. It's interesting, the term that Jesus used here about the Samaritan. It says, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. It's the word compassion. He felt what the guy felt. The first two guys walked past the hurting and injured man, and their concern was more for themselves than it was for the person in pain. They might have even been afraid for their own lives. They're like, man, if I stop and help this guy, maybe it's a booby trap, and they're going to jump out, and they're going to rob me, kill me. I can't do that. I got to keep moving. Got to keep moving. Eyes focused, down the road. Let's go. Let's keep moving. But the Samaritan comes by, and he has pity. He has compassion. And even in our day-to-day, where do we locate pity and compassion? It comes out of our heart. And so Jesus says, the people that you think have the least amount of heart, in this story, he had the most heart. He was willing to get into the trench. He was willing to get dirty at his own expense. He was willing to care for this man, put him up on his own donkey, walk alongside, take him to a place of safety. I think this story so illustrates the power of what Jesus was all about. He's always been about helping the hurting, about loving the most broken, about putting his arms around those that are most damaged, most wounded, and saying, come on. Let's come back together. Let's be one. Let me help you. Let me love you. Let me serve you. And that is what this church has always been about. Thank you for your willingness to serve and love and help people in the ditch. To get dirty if you have to make the lives of other people around us better. You know how it happens every Sunday when we tell a story, one of Jesus' stories, you typically have an experience that upcoming week where you have to decide how you're going to interact with that moment of life based on the story. Last week I told you about my grandma's yeast rolls, and several of you texted me and Facebooked me this week and said, A, we had to make rolls this week. Thanks a lot, Ted. And then B, we had to deal with the consequence of being yeast in our context. And so I'm sure that some of us this week are going to find ourselves in a situation where we're going to rub up against somebody that's hurting and broken, needs help. We're going to have to ask ourselves somewhere deep inside, what's my agenda for this moment? Because I know what my written agenda is, and it's to not stop and spend time or money or cause or heart or love on this situation. My written agenda is I got to keep moving because I got an appointment. It's an important one. But all of a sudden I find a situation in front of me that demands a response. What will my response be? What will it be? Who's your neighbor? I don't think that the pain of the world, as we have come to be aware of it today in our culture because of the access to media and the instantaneous response that not only we get from the pain of the world, but that we can give back to the pain of the world, I don't think we can respond to everything. We can't give money to every cause. We can't help make everything better. But we can when it's right in front of us, when it's close to us. So when you combine personal awareness, I see a man lying beside the road. He's in a ditch. He's in a bad way. He's all bloody. He's naked. He's beat up. Somebody should help that man. You combine awareness with proximity. I'm close enough. I could probably help. But maybe somebody else will come along. Wait a minute. Maybe I am that somebody else. Awareness plus proximity plus opportunity. Gosh, I don't really have a lot to give right now, and I'm not an EMT. I'm not really certified. I'm not trained in this, but there's obviously a hole here. I can patch that up, and you know what? You could wear my shirt, and I got a few bucks I could give. My last few bucks, but I could give it to help this person. Awareness plus proximity plus opportunity means I get to be the Samaritan in that person's life. So who will you find this week? I don't know. It's the fun of living this story out.